Hey all, welcome to our group presentation on counseling clients of European descent. My name is Nicole Mazer, and my group is Brian, Juana, Tiara, and Lauren. You'll see on the left here, we have pictures of lots of different European flags because it's a very diverse group of people, as well as on the right, you'll see all the different countries within Europe. There are many different faces of European Americans. You probably recognize some. For example, there's a stereotype you'll see in the bottom left is a picture of Italian American gangsters, as well as on the right is a bunch of different European politicians that we have at different levels of government.
The next slide is, can you guess the answer? This is just a quick quiz to go over a couple of topics that are relevant to this ethnic group. So first question, the European American ethnic group, is it a homogeneous group? And of course, as Nicole just mentioned, the answer to that is false. This group covers people from European countries and states that extend from Iceland to Russia, Finland to Greece. So it's a broad, diverse group. Second question, does individualism foster a positive view regarding personal change? The answer to this question is true. European Americans tend to value individualism and individual power to affect personal change. Third question, did Roman Catholicism drive meritocracy and the associated American dream? The answer here is no. Calvinism is the winner here, and Calvinism emphasizes good fortune as evidence of righteousness and a hard work ethic, which were drivers of the notion of the American dream. Last question, European Americans, can they be both oppressors and oppressed in America? And unfortunately, the answer here is true. White Americans benefit from great privilege in this country, whether that is acknowledged or not. However, more recent European immigrants may suffer oppression in the US because of language barriers, educational barriers, or other country-specific cultural differences.
All right, so there's distinct groups of Europeans. There's the Western Europeans from England and Germany, and there's Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans. There's different migration groups to the United States. First was from the British Isles, you may know from your history books, 1600 to 1800s. The second wave from 1840s to 1850s were people from Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia. They were fleeing famine, religious persecution, political conflicts. They tended to be younger, poorer, and Catholic. The third wave, 1880 to 1920, 20 million Southern and Eastern European immigrants arrived for a better life or fleeing religious persecution. Then immigration kind of stopped during the 1960s. In part due to communist governments and restrictions, and restarted again in the 1990s, especially with Eastern European immigrants to the United States. So this graph shows just how great the numbers used to be in the 1990s, with Europeans in the teal going about the 100,000 people. Immigrants to the US. And then if you look to the right of the graph, in about 2010, European numbers are lower and Asian immigrant numbers are highest. And this graph just shows different immigrants from different parts of Europe, Eastern Europe heralding the highest numbers, and then Northern, Western, Southern Europe.
Okay, this slide will go over some distinguishing traits for white Americans. To note, this is sort of the general values or beliefs that are valued in the US, typically by white Americans or Americans of European descent, depending on their level of acculturation. So first, meritocracy, as mentioned before, this is driven in large part by Calvinist religious beliefs. that emphasize hard work and are driving that notion of finding success in the US by pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and working hard. This, of course, is otherwise known as the American dream. Second, individualism. Of course, this doesn't need much explanation. It works on par with meritocracy, emphasizing autonomy and also the value of personal contributions and personal responsibility. Liberty, this one, of course, the US is known as the home of the free, but for many, this is only aspirational. So for some white Americans, it can actually pose a conflict because they are dealing with the contradiction between reality and the value that they're espousing. So there may be this working hand in hand with this sense of individualism and accountability and a drive for the right of each individual to freely choose and make choices, balancing that against the reality and the guilt that can arise if that value is not actually playing out in society. Last but not least, an analytical and empirical worldview. This speaks to the emphasis on a rational thought and evidence based problem solving. It holds to objective, scientific, and research backed approaches and conclusions. And again, just to emphasize, more recent European immigrants may or may not have ascribed fully to any or all of these traits. So it's important to assess that and consider their own traits that they may be bringing with them.
And so moving on to cultural mindsets, that's going to be the ways of thinking that provide the context for and shape the actions of the people within a particular culture. And those are going to change and evolve over time. And so within this group, the three that stand out are going to be the Protestant work ethic, the American dream, and the melting pot. And so the Protestant work ethic came from the primarily white English founders of the early colonies, and it ended up being the impetus for much of the capitalistic economic development in the early colonies and contributed to the idea of manifest destiny when it was considered with the Calvinist understanding of predestination. And as the country developed more fully from a social and political standpoint, this ended up morphing into the idea of the American dream that again is undergirded by that belief that the United States operates as a meritocracy where how well somebody does is based upon their skills and work ethic and abilities and not outside forces. The idea of the American dream is also one factor that contributed to the migration of many to the US, causing the melding of many different cultures, which then led to the idea of the melting pot that is the United States. And so, as we move on to the cultural factors for that, those mindsets all play into the cultural factors that influence mental health, especially for those who become more fully acculturated and then are considered white American ethnics. These include the idea of meritocracy, the push for personal autonomy and individualism, and then for a lot of people, the loss of culture for those white Americans who have separated from their country of origin for multiple generations. For those who are more recent immigrants or still hold to more traditional cultural markers, you're going to be looking at pre-migration and post-migration stressors. So pre-migration stressors being things that would cause people to immigrate, such as war, famine, or simply seeking better prospects for self or family. Post-migration stressors being things that are faced after immigration has happened, such as loss of support or family and social structures, stresses of relocation, and then a stress to acculturate. Age and gender are also going to be factors that cross over both of these groups. And then next, when we talk about mental health issues, there are a lot of similarities and a large concepts that underlie both of the groups of European Americans, white American ethnics, but they may show themselves in different ways. So isolation that's felt by white American ethnics may more likely stem from the social or the autonomy and individualism that are seen as ideals, where you don't ask for help when you're hurting or struggling because that's your problem to deal with, not someone else's. This can also cause issues for men, especially with being able to express emotion properly, if at all. For European Americans, the same idea may have to do with leaving family or social support behind, where you now feel like you have to face these new experiences alone. Marriage and family issues may manifest in white American ethnics as women feel devalued or less than others, especially in households that are more patriarchal in structure. And for European Americans, this may deal with marriage issues due to feeling like they need to change spousal roles if they come from a less egalitarian society. And lastly, European Americans who are recent immigrants may also face the unique challenge of transitioning to a new country, and might be disillusioned about the difficulty of that transition.
All right, so discrimination that European Americans face. Back in the 1880 to 1921, if you remember from your history books, there was nativism from the old wave of Anglo-Saxon Protestant immigrants to the new wave of Catholic immigrants. And that showed up in boycotts of Catholic merchants, scapegoating for social ills, literacy tests. More recently, there were laws that were passed in the United States that caused immigrants to fear arrest or deportation, even for minor crimes or misdemeanors. The PRWOR Act denied access to federal public benefits, food stamps, so that makes it harder for the immigrant to make ends meet. There's the issue of racism. People from Eastern and Southern Europe may be seen as inferior in race, intellect, or as there's a risk that they will steal from us. They may pass as white homogeneous culturally, but that can be a disadvantage when the English proficiency or their skills does not come up to par with that. There's also microaggressions, thick accent, low English proficiency, poverty, or different looks can cause these immigrants to be dismissed in getting new jobs or getting jobs in line with their educational preparation back home. Sometimes their degrees are even discounted.
So, some of the keys to counseling, as we've mentioned, this isn't a homogenous group. However, there are some tips and tricks that can be used in counseling that will be effective, such as traditional counseling methods typically are effective because, in general, they were created by European or European Americans. In many of these methods, these approaches simultaneously use and challenge European cultural norms. For example, particularly Eastern Europeans, pleasantries aren't necessarily as important. They like to keep it real and get to the point. And so, with that, all leads to the importance of the therapeutic relationship. That is going to be relatively countercultural to the relationships that they have outside of the counseling room. And so the counselor's job it will be important for them to establish mutual respect, unconditional positive regard, free expression, non-judgment, and accurate empathetic understanding. In these instances, the healing will come from that client's ability to step outside of the limits of their cultural norms and open up through this therapeutic relationship. The next one is going to be helping the client determine their cultural values because of different levels of enculturation from different European countries. These values are going to be a relatively a relative term, even though it's sometimes seen as absolute. And so, helping your client understand what value really means will be extremely important. For example, family values, it's a vague term that needs clarification because it can be significantly different depending on who's sitting in your counseling room. And so the counselor should clarify those values to each individual client and working with a client to conceptualize what those conflicts really are within their cultural understanding will play a role in helping figure out the presenting problem and any underlying issues. And the final one is going to be consciousness raising, helping a client develop insight or deepen awareness and fully understand their own culture and making values of their culture explicit will help the client have a better self concept, power dynamics, and privilege that play out in their lives. As being white in America will be very helpful. And processing the congruence between white American cultural values and the values of their individual within the culture. And within that is going to be the ability for them to choose. So, one of the more powerful gifts of an effective conscious raising gives clients the ability to choose, which is commonly valued by white American culture. However, this can play out like the difference of cultural values of achievement versus their personal passion for spending time with their family. And so within the counseling relationship, you can help them develop the instead of seeing that as an impossible situation, they can develop the understanding that the client can choose, make the choice for themselves.
Okay, so there's a couple of different effective counseling techniques. One of them is creative arts therapy. And the goal of creative arts therapy is to help find a means of identifying sources that of disconnect and frustration through channeling creative outlets. And this is typically really effective with clients who have maybe difficulty expressing concerns verbally because there might be a language barrier at play or just different cultural norms. And through this process, you have the client fully experiencing nature and culture. And it's effective because one of the things that immigrant families tend to lose in the transition to the United States is their traditions and rituals, and their family and the culture that they hold so dear. So, this creative art therapy helps to reconnect with those rituals and those traditions. A tangible example of this is in the Polish tradition. There's a deep symbolization in wreaths. And so you may have a client get a wreath and go out in nature and find different like leaves and sticks that will represent different things to them, and then they'll put together this wreath, and that is channeling this deep tradition that they have and allows them to be able to explore their cultural and their rituals. Another one is a narrative approach, and this is the deconstruction process of the dominant culture narrative, and it's the most challenging process because it focuses on the examination of one's experiences relevant to inferiority and superiority. And clients typically will feel pretty reluctant and resistant to trusting the process of self exploration and accepting their self and others fully. Um, and then there's the externalizing the problem. And this is helpful for those who have a tendency to self blame and who struggle with feelings of guilt and shame. This is really important to distinguish the problems as being ecological in nature rather than pathological tendencies that exist within the clients. For example, you may ask the client to identify how negative stereotyping in the majority culture has affected their views of themselves or others. And then the third step is reauthoring the story. And that is where the client and the counselor will collaborate to reflect on being successful in life despite or perhaps in concert with the American culture. And this process helps the clients as they just deconstruct and then reconstruct their ethnic identities. And the last one is social justice counseling. And we're going to hit on that a little more in depth on the next slide. But social justice counseling is built on 4 different principles. And social justice counseling is an effort for counselors to promote general wellness and the common good through addressing those systematic and cultural challenges to justice and equality, while focusing on and helping the individuals advocate for themselves and helping and equipping them to navigate the systems where injustice and injustice and equality exist. So those 4 principles are equity, which is the involvement in a culture-centered approach. Counselors will become familiar with the cultural practices that foster a sense of wellness for their individuals, representing various cultural groups. Access, the counselor's choice to clarify identity construction and self in their clients. Participation underscores the importance of mutuality and authenticity. And then harmony, which is a process of searching for wellness by tapping into the cultural wisdom and deconstructing the process of devaluating that immigrants may be experiencing. And why this is so important is because through this process of unmasking the client, who they are, what they do, and unmasking that cultural camouflage that is like this fertile ground for shame and isolations, counselors provide for their clients an atmosphere of authenticity and permission to be who they desire to be. And it's also a great opportunity to be able to restore your client's voice. Counselors working from this perspective can create and take advantage of opportunities to be their client's voice when they have been silenced in the process of immigrating. And so this is the conclusion of our presentation over counseling individuals and families of European descent.